The dialogue sessions are structured in an unusual way, such that everyone learns, although nobody teaches. There's no agenda or predetermined topic, no rights or wrongs, simply an open forum where all may give their views and inquire into what really matters to them.
Hello, and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm Jane Ball, co-founder of Dialogue Associates, along with Peter Garrett. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. And we're doing this by exploring the chapters of Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. In today's episode, we move from the birth of a new kind of dialogue and onto the application of dialogue in maximum security prisons. Reflecting on these chapters at the end of this episode is Leo Hylton, who is currently incarcerated in a US prison. But first, let's dive in, starting with chapter 9 of the book, Into Prison. So, Peter, in the last episode, we spoke about the birth of dialogue, and we ended with the death of David Bohm, who had a profound impact, I think, on you and also on the development of this work. As you start the chapter, you talk about one theoretical insight that I think is really important, and I would like to ask you about it. You use these words: the observer and the observed are one, and that fragmentation in the world and fragmentation in human consciousness are one phenomenon. Could you say a little bit more about what this means and why it's so important?
I would say David's death, just where you began, was really the end of a particular chapter, you know. I hadn't realized until later that it wasn't only his insight, his presence, his thinking, his, in a way, inquiry. It was also his manner. He was a humble man and took people seriously. He wasn't critical. He was about hearing what was happening and thinking about what was happening. And that's the kind of spirit of the inquiry, of the kind of insights you're talking about. So the challenge as I reviewed it after David's death was, where were we? What did we have? Well, we had an understanding that we have fragmentation in human consciousness. And that fragmentation in human consciousness, where people don't see themselves to be related to one another or interrelated, don't see the impact they're having on other people, has led to fragmentation in the world around. So we have something going on in our own consciousness, we have something going on in the world around us. The root of that is related to thinking and thought. Thinking is an active process which is quite slow. Thought is memory. So memory kicks in automatically. Thinking slows down and reviews that. So where we were at the end of the time with David Bohm was being aware of what's going on in my own thoughts and feelings, and being aware of what's going on in the room, and the relationship between them, because they're all one thing. All one thing is the extra, but can be aware of what's going on inside me, what's going on in the room, and the interconnection between the two of them. And that, becoming aware of that, we called suspending, describing some of that. Describing it while it's happening, we called proprioception. So that's kind of where we were at the point that I started reviewing the situation after David's death. Is that answering your question?
Yeah,
or not?
It is, and it's putting it in the context of the autobiographical piece. Mm-hmm. I was asking it as a theoretical question.
Okay.
You're putting it in the autobiography, which is at this point in your story, David has gone and you're thinking, what have I learnt? Where am I? Where am I going? I guess kind of past, present and future come together.
Well, it was a dramatic emotional event.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever read accounts of Mahatma Gandhi's death.
No.
I really recommend it. Like, he was a humble man, had no role in life, but when he died, millions and millions of people followed the trail of his death. And Nehru, who spoke, said, the light of the world has gone out. Now, it wasn't that with David Bohm, but certainly the source of the insight that began had gone. So this was a real moment of, there wasn't any doubt about continuity, but there was a doubt about origination.
Could you say a little bit more about what you started to do after David's death? You went on a journey of inquiry to understand a bit more about some of the influences. Tell us a bit about that as context.
Well, I mean, the first thing I did was arrange another dialogue, pulled together everybody to think about David's death, which we talked about, I think, his last inquiry about why identify oneself with one's body. But at the same time, I want to understand the background influences. And one of them was his psychotherapist who helped him with his depressions. It was Patrick Demare. So he's a man I contacted. I had been to one session that he had run, and I asked to go to another, to meet him and go to another. And that was quite a revelation in a way, because with the sessions I arranged with David Bohm, he was the star man in the room that everybody wanted to get next to in the lunch queue or whatever. The session I went to with Patrick, it was in North London at the Group Analytics Society, where he ran the median group section. I didn't know which one he was. Into the room, there were, 30 or 40 people, perhaps 30 for the evening meeting, an ongoing group who are learning how to become median group conveners and practitioners. And I couldn't tell who it was. And there wasn't a quiet now, let's start the meeting. Just when the room went quiet, their dialogue began. And during the course of it, I realized who Patrick was. So there were a number of things that were quite different. Again, it was really the second dialogue I'd been to that I hadn't arranged. And it was a bit unusual in that everybody was training to become a practitioner. Everything I'd been involved in, everybody was there in their own account. So it was a bit of on behalf of in the room. But I enjoyed it, finding out what the new social rules were in the group, and learnt a lot.
Yeah. So what was relevant in Patrick Demare's work that you took into dialogue?
Well, he was completely different from David. The root of his work was related to shell-shocked people during the war. People during the war had been close to exploding shell, and they had deeply stuck memory, traumatized memory, which kicked in and interfered with how they worked. And dealing with that, they dealt with that individually, psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists. What they discovered was groups of them talking together was more effective. So he started to get interested in this idea of group therapy. And he was very interesting and very skilled at it. So his interest was not only group therapy, but it was also based on emotional trauma. So what I felt in meeting him was here was an emotional side of the intellectual side, which David carried. Patrick was very fuzzy emotionally, I felt, very difficult to understand. So the combination of the two. The big thing about Patrick was that he understood sociotherapy. So he understood social systems. And on that basis, that affected the work I did thereafter a lot. Mm-hmm.
You also, I think, through Patrick Demare, that was a step on your way into prison. Into Prison is the title of this chapter. How did that come about?
Well, I went one evening, enjoyed it. I asked to go again, still trying to find out the background for David. And it turned out that they were graduating, all the students, and being given their certificates. So it was quite nice to be there while they all had done their year's study and were duly graduated. And then Patrick said, and I want to graduate Peter as well. So I thought, this is a bit unusual in that I haven't done the year's course they have that they've paid for. And he's going to give me a graduation certificate. So, but I'm polite, and he gave me the certificate. I found out later it was a kind of honorary certificate, because he had heard from David Bohm about my work with him, and it was a mark of respect. But in that same evening, one of the graduates was a probation officer in a high and maximum security prison in Cambridgeshire. Patrick kind of got us both together and said, you might think about joining Dave on this piece of work he wants to do in the prison. And the piece of work he wants to do, of course, was based on a paper I'd written with David Bohm, which he'd put to the authorities as part of his method for what he wanted to do in the prison. So Dave, like Patrick, was a very emotional guy. This Dave is Dave Parsons, not David Bohm. If I call one David Bohm and this one Dave Parsons was a much more emotional man, big, but very good at his job as a probation officer.
What was the proposal that he had made to the authorities in the prison?
So he's in a new prison which had recently opened, having a lot of trouble, and he felt that part of the thing was to settle down the prisoners who were in that prison. And he'd tried doing some group work in the segregation block, which is where people are isolated for long periods of time, not that effectively. And then he proposed doing a dialogue group. And the dialogue group, the idea was that people would start to talk and think together about the very essences that I described, how they think and feel, what's going on around them, and how they relate themselves to that.
And presumably that would, you said it was quite disturbed in the prison at the time, that would lead to an emotional settling and therefore less material disturbance.
Yes, I wasn't really thinking that when I went. I was thinking, here's another opportunity to really grow the dialogue work, which had been of a particular kind. But more than that, personally, I was thinking, I've made my trip overland to India. I've gone everywhere I can. This sounds like a part of the world I don't know much about, and I'd like to find out, and particularly this very remote part of the world where people don't go into prisons and meet serious offenders is quite close by. It's just down the road, not far away. So I felt a kind of draw, the challenge of going there, a little bit of a concern or fear as well, like, will I meet some people that would challenge a bit my own sense of identity and who I am and what I'm doing. So it felt like a great invitation. I was pleased to accept it.
Good. The prison was HMP Whitemoor. Tell us a bit, you say Dave Parsons was responding to the disturbance in the prison. Could you just give a little bit more context about Whitemoor at that time?
I was in order to go and join this group that would be set up, I was invited to go and have a security briefing. So I drove there one afternoon and I was quite surprised. Because a new prison, it was like drawing up at a Waitrose supermarket, the car park. That's the closest thing I can think of. And Waitrose being a more upper market kind of supermarket. Walls, so you couldn't see the prison, razor wire on the top. Went in and I was just very interested in prisons. They have a colour coding saying the state of security of the prison, which might be red or orange or green or whatever. Quite careful how they check you and search you. And then I sat down with a security officer whose job was to brief me on how to behave well in the prison. I think his intention was to make me feel quite frightened. Don't reveal anything about yourself, your private life. Just know that these people are really nasty people. They can really do you a lot of harm. He was very strong. He was also very critical. He felt they led the lives of Riley, and meaning they led a luxurious life. I discovered later that many of them did. They were actually, in the maximum security prison, able to order crayfish and so on from the supermarket to eat every day. And it was a peculiar mix of situations of serious offenders, the ones you read about in the paper every day, the anti-heroes, a kind of luxury, a kind of violence, a kind of difficulty. So it was a new prison which had not settled down, and as a result there were regular assaults. There were a number of murders while I was there. There was a riot. There was all the things that you imagine might be happening in that kind of situation were there at that point.
Did you have second thoughts at any time? partly because of what sounds like quite a dangerous environment, but also being told on the security briefing that you couldn't say all of these things. And yet in a dialogue, presumably you would expect to be able to say what was the right thing to say for you at the time.
Well, I didn't accept the premise of the briefing, to be honest. I thought I would learn firsthand, see what it would be appropriate to say or not say, and I'm not a paid member of staff, so I wouldn't be in the same situation as the man who was briefing me. So I listened carefully and respected it, but I thought I'll make my own call on the appropriate way to behave. The only time I had second thoughts was I did make my telephone ex-directory. So my telephone number was no longer listed anywhere. And I did find evidence later of it being tapped. So that made me think, I guess I'm in touch with people that others might want to know what's being said and what's being done. I might be a security risk myself. So my only second thought was I don't want to put my family at risk in some way. Apart from that, I never had a question about this was the right way to go.
It's very clear what a different environment this was to the previous episodes where you've talked about running sessions in fancy hotels in Switzerland or in Israel. Or
well, just to keep in mind, not only had David died, we were both full-time. He was a full-time professor at university. I was running a property development company with others in London. It wasn't my company. I was employed in it, a director in it. That company went into receivership. The whole property market collapsed with the increasing rate of borrowing at the time. So I was unemployed. So I have to say, it was quite a blessing because that's what led me to be able to go full-time into doing work in the prison. But it was not an easy time. I had no income. I had a challenge financially. I had a number of... My brother had a divorce and went into depression. My best friend went into depression. So I was a little bit working it out. But I had time on my hands. And I decided, that was the crunch that said, no, I need to put more time into this rather than less. If the property hadn't gone, I would have carried on as a businessman and been a wealthier man than I am now, but I wouldn't have known some of the things I now do or had the experience I have.
People talk about the idea of synchronicity, don't they? How do you think these things happen? Because you, as you say, what could have been a disaster for some people actually created a great opportunity, presumably without which the story of a new kind of dialogue would be very different.
I think it depends on your receptivity, really. I think there are opportunities appearing all the time. Are you open to them? Do you pick them up and go with them or not? And it depends a little bit on curiosity initially to spot them, but then a willingness to say, yes, I'll go for it. I have that in spades. I'll have a go and see what happens. I've also often failed, but I've learnt all the time. And failure is fine. So I think this presented itself in the way that things always do, and I was pleased for it. The actual, having had the security briefing, there was then the invitation to go to the first meeting of this newly formed dialogue group. One of the prisoners had made a poster for Dave, and it said something like, when you're dealing with monsters, make sure you don't become a monster yourself. And the idea was that prisoners might feel that staff were treating them monstrously, but also staff might feel that some of the prisoners were monsters. And I think they were both right. that was going on both ways. And the idea we had with Dave was not a prisoner group as much as a group which was mixed with both.
Just before we go into that, I guess I just wanted to underline for our listeners this idea about receptivity. One thing you said about yourself is you're willing to say yes and have a go, and it's succeeded and at times hasn't. But actually the receptivity to what's the potential in any situation, I think is a really valuable thing to take a pause on for anybody who's listening to this, anybody who's reading your book, what's presenting itself to me in my life at the moment. that I might want to take up, and who knows where that will lead. So I just wanted to underline that before we continue.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd say there are parts of one's life that one leads on automatic. You don't really think when you get up and clean your teeth, have a shower, get dressed, go to work or whatever. There are all sorts of things that are on automatic. But there's also the matter of being aware of what's happening and perceptive. Things present themselves often. Think about that, and then you drop them, whatever. Well, it's worth following some of them and seeing. And in a way, I suppose our conversation may seed some of those ideas. Not opportunities we know, that opportunities other people know that they could pick up and move with.
Good. Yeah. So let's go back into Whitemoor then. Your first dialogue session. Tell us what happened.
I was talking about it the other day. My first thing was, what do you wear when you go into a prison? Which I ended up wearing a leather jacket, a little bit of security, I think. But I wanted to be clear, I wasn't a prisoner and I wasn't a member of staff. But once into the prison, we met a problem which is not uncommon. Dave met me at the gate. There was one other volunteer, an elderly man, and the three of us went into the prison. We went to start the first dialogue group, and we had about a dozen volunteers. And then at the gate they said, "We're sorry, we have a shortage of staff. We're not going to be able to do the dialogue." So Dave, who seemed to be used to this happening, and anybody who works in a prison will recognise it, said, "Okay, we'll do the dialogue group on the wing, which is where the cells and accommodation are." So rather than going to a public meeting room or a chapel meeting room or whatever, off I was taken onto the accommodation wing. When we got there, the idea was we'd have the meeting in the TV room. And when we went towards the TV room, Dave said, "Okay, just wait there." And off he went with somebody else to go and find the prisoners and get them there. So then I was on my own the first time I went into a prison, on a wing which houses about 60 prisoners on different levels, all wandering around. And I'm thinking, who are these people and what would they want? The first man who came up to me was smallish, but he had a tattoo of a spider on the side of his cheek and chin, and the spider's web went round his neck and down his chest. So I thought, okay, I've not met a man like this before, but he was very keen to meet me and quite assertive. So I was trying to understand what I was getting myself into and how it would work when Dave reappeared and said, "Here's the TV room," took me. The TV room didn't have a TV in it. It had been smashed up, but it was a big enough room for what we wanted. Opened the door, said, "There you are," closed it and left. So when I went into the room for the first dialogue session, there was one man there. He was a black man from West Africa. He was very big. And unlike the man with the tattoo, his biceps, his upper arms were bigger than my thighs. He must work out. I don't know what he takes, but so I thought, well, there's 15 chairs here or whatever, where shall I sit? So I thought, right, I'll go and sit next to him. That's the confident thing to do. And so I sat next to him, expecting him to say, "Who are you?" or something. And he said nothing. And then he stood up and he walked to the other side of the room and sat down. So said nothing. So there's two of us in the room. I'm left on my own on the opposite side. He's not saying anything. I thought, okay, well, I don't know what's going on here. It wasn't that I don't know how to deal with this problem. I don't know what this problem is. So I sat there like we were in a dentist waiting room where you know you're both there, but you don't talk to each other until all the others came in, room filled up, and Dave duly began the little dialogue. The explanation for the dialogue was, we're going to all talk and think together. Want to hear your views and what you really think. This is where you say it how it is and get it all out in the open, and we'll see what we learn together. And the first speaker said, you want all our opinions? Dave said, yes. He said, opinions are like arseholes. Everybody has one. Okay, that's an interesting beginning to our conversation, but he was absolutely accurate in that what he was saying was everybody has an opinion, nobody doesn't have one, those opinions differ, and all we're going to do is have an argument. So if you want to have an argument, this is a great setup for it. And of course, we didn't want to have an argument, but I liked the bluntness of it. Some people, it takes a long time to find out what they're thinking. This man was said already thinking straight away. So I felt we could work with this. It wasn't concealed, it was out in the open. And we had quite a good conversation, good enough that people wanted to come back the following week. I certainly did.
Could you say a little bit more about how would you characterise these dialogues? They sound very different from the ones we've heard about in the previous episodes, and we'll probably a bit later analyse the kind of learning in terms of dialogue practice, but just what was the feel of it?
It was a stark contrast between the last dialogue with David Bohm and the first dialogue in the prison. It was about exactly the same thing, but these were not theoretical people. It was a re-read, a re-understanding of this group. They weren't worried about the cosmos. They were worried about their own survival. That some worried about immediate threats of violence, but mainly how do you survive in a situation which is a very tough situation. I used to keep chickens. If you keep a lot of cockerels and put them in a small coop, they will fight to the death. So this is not a clever environment to hold a lot of ill-disciplined people with a lot of emotional baggage in one tight space. So the early sessions were very much blowing off steam. And there were things that people had been feeling about others and about themselves. They just had to get out in the open. So early on, it was largely shaped in terms of complaints about the prison, how the prison doesn't work, is not fair, doesn't treat you the right way, and so on. My colleague, another volunteer, of course, wanted to try and resolve those, but whatever you resolved, it wasn't resolution they were looking for, it was getting all that out. As we went further, of course, we could talk about any topic, and we did then start to talk about things beyond the workings of the prison. The way we did it was conversational, a bit like we'd meet, welcome everybody, and then either Dave or I would say, well, what did you think about the football on the weekend? Manchester United have been losing all the time, and lo and behold, they beat Everton 3-0. What do you think? And of course, those who like football would come in straight away and explain why it was that way. And you would kind of move the conversation along for those who weren't so keen on football to talk about the training or talk about the money and, how much they get paid. And as you move the conversation around, you could gradually get everybody involved. They were then giving their own thoughts freely, not trying to be clever or trying to win, and by thinking about it, they got very involved and very interested and relaxed quite a lot. And they weren't the same people. We met once a week for 2.5 hours. We met every week continuously. So week after week, there were quite a few regulars, some new people, some older, and people started to get interested in each other's stories and what was happening. So, have you got a dog? So what do I think? The security guy tells me, don't say anything about yourself. Well, I say, yeah, I've got a border collie called Harry. Is that a threat to my life? I don't think it is. I mean, come on. So we talk about Harry, but then we talk about his dog. Well, he used to take his dog hunting. Well, what does that mean? And where does it go? And gradually, those kind of conversations lead to people to think about their lives, what they were receptive to and because you can be receptive to things that don't help you and what they picked up on and where they went. And we started a kind of ongoing weekly inquiry into the world around ourselves and so on, punctuated by news of landings on space or cyclones or financial collapse or sexual crimes or whatever was of interest.
Yeah. And that's from that original meeting once a week for 2.5 hours, you extended the work in Whitemoor. Do you want to just give us that context before we go?
Yeah, so we met once a week. We made them into 15-week terms and stopped for a few weeks because I was driving 2.5 hours from home to get to the prison and back again. So it was 5 hours travel as well as the dialogue. So I needed some time off. And then after every 15 weeks, we wrote a report. I wrote a report. I kept notes, and I said, this is what we talked about, and gave it to all the participants. They came back the next week and said whether it was accurate or not, and we amended it, and then we published it and put it around the prison. And that reporting of that was really, really important. The challenge is not first it's how do you get people talking freely and honestly and genuinely, not trying to make up how they present their ideas, but giving them openly. The second bit is how do you get people to be reflective? You can't learn unless you're reflective. And you can learn some things, but most things you need to learn, you have to realize, well, that was a good idea. That bit wasn't really a very good idea. Or I could do that differently. And these reports got people reflective. They started to see we're making a bit of progress. So I got a register and got people to sign in every week. And we created some remarkable things. We created freedom of movement that anybody could choose on the day to come to the dialogue group. Well, prisons are about not having freedom of movement. And for any other course, you had to register it, you had to be taken to it. They could walk from their cell to the dialogue group. So freedom of speech, I don't know if it's quite freedom of speech, but an openness to talk about any topic. So there are a number of things there, and the dialogue carried on through that first year. Dave went back to probation in the community. So I now find myself running the dialogue group in the prison, bringing in other people. I didn't have any credentials or any whatever, but I contracted with the prison to do it and kept going. And we kept going year after year. We kept going in all for 9 years. The tail end, you came into that, you'll remember.
Yeah. Can I just draw it back a bit? So you're using the reporting particularly as a way of drawing people into reflection and their own first-hand learning. So it's the kind of thread through this whole book is first-hand learning. So you're drawing all of the participants in the dialogue into that. It's one thing I hear in your...
Into reflection. I mean, there were quite a few changes going on, but when we started reporting, feeding back, but then doing a written report, they started to think about what they were saying. They were very proud. I said that, so showing people. But there's quite an art to doing it, because if you name the individual and you say that was Francis said that, that man may benefit or suffer for it. So you've got to make it anonymous. But the issues they're talking about, how things are happening in the prison and so on, are the concerns of everyone in the prison. So that led to understanding their different subcultural groupings. And rather than saying, Sam said this, you'd say, well, a group of prisoners who were in for violent crimes didn't agree. So you'd be getting the collective position out in the open, which was manageable and understandable for people. So it was partly reflection, and that reflection then led to reflection into people's own lives, which was again interesting. They wanted to be understood after a while. Now, I don't mean that. I mean this about my dog or whatever it is. And in the beginning, all the adjectives and adverbs were swear words. We just on and on and on. It was just very repetitive and not descriptive. Gradually, they started to get a better vocabulary, started to find words that they didn't use very much, and started to become more articulate. Over the time, they became really good speakers. They could, to a group of people, say, this is what I mean. I don't mean that. I mean this about what happened. And why do you say that? So they started to listen to each other. We built up some rather simple approaches to the group. Anybody has the opportunity to speak when their time comes. The aim is to be honest and open about what you really think and feel, and when other people speak, to take them seriously, except that's what they're trying to do as well. Can't talk behind people's backs and so on. And so we created, through the group, a number of rather simple rules for that environment, which led to the very same kind of inquiry we had been having with David Bohm.
Yeah, so you have rules about what happens in the dialogue as it's happening, but what's different than anything you've done before is you have a longer term process. I know you said there was some kind of changeover of participants, but people could come back week after week after week, and so you get to see the change and the impact of this way of talking and thinking on individuals.
Yeah, well, the work with David Bohm was over 8 years, which is a good time, but the main groupings were quite short, 3 days at a time. And the ongoing was a smaller group of us with Don and Anna and David and Sarah and so on. In this case, there was a continuous group and the turnover was low. These were serious offenders, mainly in prison for very lengthy periods of time. There were very few releases while I was there. And that allows for a longer term inquiry. That was part of the situation. They accepted the kind of way of operating. The interesting thing is, if you're inquiring, which is what that approach led to, you can't be violent at the same time. You can be violent in attitude or in action to another person to shut them up and stop them saying what they're saying. But if the undertaking is that you're trying to understand what they're saying and why, you can't hit them in the mouth at the same time. But it was clear that the facilitation was one of getting these simple approaches to stick. Otherwise, it would become physical. It was quite clear early on to smack somebody in the mouth wouldn't be a big issue. That clearly wouldn't help a dialogue process or having more dialogues. So there was something about how do you facilitate a group where people might act out rather than talk it through in words, the emotions and so on they had. And that does require a kind of resilience with a lot of tough people to say, hold on, Frank, stop. No, stop. We need first to hear what he's saying. We'll come to you, but it's not your turn now. Wait. I found you can't, if people are getting excited and emotional, moving towards violation and violence, don't retreat. Don't back off and it'll work itself out or get, like you need to go further into it, was my experience.
What was the experience of, or as far as you knew it, of the staff that were involved?
Well, the staff, we had to have in the room. It was a requirement by law to have security in the room with us. So that's their function. This is the security staff. We wanted them there because we wanted a mixture. What we wanted was a representation of all the people who live and work in the prison. And we achieved that over time. We achieved security staff, non-security staff, people from the chaplaincy, psychiatrists, people from the public and so on. We achieved a big mix. At the beginning, the security staff were pretty cautious. Like they were out of their depth in a way and a bit concerned about being in a group of prisoners and being open. Some were open and quite willing. So often, by requirement, there were 2 security officers in every session, and there would be somewhere between 15 and 20 prisoners. And some would sit in, some would not want to. Over time, they all did. Over time, it was accepted when you were detailed as a security officer to be on the dialogue group, you sat in the circle. You could speak or not speak, and gradually they spoke. And gradually, of course, the prisoners didn't want them there, so we had to push on the prisoners as well. But gradually it became the prisoners talking with the staff at times about what was happening and why it was happening. So it had a big impact on them.
And did that leak out into the rest of the prison? You talked about the free movement that was enabled.
Initially not. Initially it was just the individual. So early on I had a guy stop and he said, "That was amazing, that dialogue group." I said, "That was good." He said, I never heard that man say anything worth listening to. And he was talking about a poorly educated black guy. I never heard him say anything sensible. But it was interesting what he said, wasn't it? So they were just starting to notice that there could be a meaningful interaction. But early on not. I mean, we had after 6 or 7 months, they started to, for example, they started strip searching every prisoner when they left the dialogue. So we left the dialogue and we were talking about social experiences and what was going on in the world. And some of them were quite delicate conversations and quite personal conversations. And then they would strip search everyone, pull down their trousers, look at them and with a torch and say, okay, you can go. That does have a little bit of an impact. So there were reactions to the dialogue group early on. But over time, more and more people came, more offenders came. The way it operated became common. So when we began a group, I didn't say these are the rules. I'd say, well, somebody who's in the dialogue group explain how it works. And they explained it pretty well. I had a bit if I needed to, but they knew what it was. And then over time, people who had never come, there'd be 2 or 3 new people, I'd say to the people who had never come, how do you think this dialogue group works? And they would describe it pretty well. We'd help a little bit with the thing, but it became an understanding in the prison that this was part of what was available in the prison and how it worked. And it became a kind of social centre of it, I suppose. At one point, I had close to 20% of the prisoners involved in a dialogue every week. So that's I'm very proud of myself, this little beginning.
And you can hear that each step of you keep adapting and changing what you're doing in relation to what happens in the room, but actually what you're also learning about the prison overall. So it becomes a kind of microcosm of activity, of what's happening in the wider system that you're part of.
It evolved in its own way, and the aim was to take it beyond that initial group.
In our next episode, we'll pick up on the development of the work. I'd like to go a bit more back a bit into an individual. Mm-hmm. You've talked about how people were changing, but there's one individual that you talk about quite a bit, a guy called Jimmy Robinson, who is in your dialogue regularly. Right. Can you tell us Jimmy's story and why dialogue is relevant to it?
Yeah, so I think he may be the only prisoner I name in the book, Jimmy Robinson. So if you lived in the UK 20 years ago or more, probably 40 years ago now, he was quite famous. There were 4 people who were imprisoned for murdering a newspaper delivery boy. So 4 of them were charged, found guilty in court, and imprisoned for life. And in prison, people have a sense of whether people are innocent or guilty. And Jimmy Robinson, along with his 3 colleagues, was believed to be innocent. He was known to be a criminal, but a petty criminal, more, robbing shops and things like that. But the murder of the boy, people believed he wasn't guilty. And he fought hard for his innocence during the time. Prisons are tough places. People pushed razor blades under his cell door and so on when he was in solitary confinement. People were encouraging him to take his own life and so on. But he's got a tough guy, a nice guy. He came to the dialogue and kept coming. He wasn't the hardest. I had quite a number of really heavy-duty offenders. By heavy-duty, I mean they had done some bad things and had a bad reputation and basically, don't fuck with me if you want to feel okay with yourself, came into the dialogue group. And that helped because it's all about power and power structure. And the hotheads needed occasionally to be told cool down. At times people need to hear more experience and so on. But Jimmy came, sat in the same seat every day, rolled his cigarettes. He had come to public note because there was a time when prisons had tiles on the roof, and some prisoners managed to break through the tiles and get onto the roof. And he was one of them. He did the longest roof protest in the UK. It's difficult because if you get a prisoner on the roof, they can be seen over the wall. The TV crew then sits with its camera on them all the time. So appearing on TV on the roof, they can't endanger your life. So basically what they did was fed prisoners who did a roof protest until they got fed up with it. But Jimmy stayed, he did the longest one there was. One story, for example, is the governor, the guy in charge of the prison, trying to persuade him to come down. He asked to meet with him, said, fine, I'll meet with you tomorrow at noon. At noon, when the time came, the governor came along, but the governor was 2 minutes late. So Jimmy said to him, won't talk to you today, you're 2 minutes late, bugger off. What he was saying was, that's what I've had for the last 15 years. Turn up 2 minutes late, go away. Said, people don't know how to treat each other as human beings. I want them to know that, you know. But he was a great contributor in the dialogue, and his three colleagues, all had natural life sentences. 2 of them came in. And then one day the news came through that they'd been stitched up by the Birmingham police. They'd falsified the statements. They had a way forensically of showing that, and so they would be released. So we had this kind of like a carnival dialogue where Jimmy Robinson was going to be released. It just doesn't happen, and people were jealous, they were envious, they were excited, they were thinking about themselves being released and so on, and so it was amazing. And the next week, they really wanted to talk about it, and the next week, and then all it required was the papers from the Home Secretary, and they didn't come. And a month, and month after month. A year later, he's still in prison, still awaiting release, and no papers from... Well, of course, the Home Secretary didn't agree with the ruling and didn't want to release the papers. It took months and months and months before he gets released. So it was a sitting anxiety, but he had done well. He got support outside, and it was accepted. Carl Bridgewater was the newspaper boy who got murdered. And then one evening, just before he was going to bed, he had the radio on Radio 5. Radio 5, they said, Jimmy Robinson's going to be released tomorrow. So he turned to some mate and said, did you hear that? I think I'm going to be released tomorrow. Yeah. Didn't hear from the police, from the prison authorities or anything. In the morning, they said, right, bring your things. They drove him. He'd been then in prison over 18 years. Hadn't opened a door himself for 18 years, on a regimented life. They drove him into London, they took him into the High Court and released him. And he walked out the front door into the street on Aldwych, and there were thousands of people, because releasing people, you know, people like the fact the police got it wrong and he's released, but there in front of thousands of people interviewed by television. I talked to him, he said, I had an out-of-body experience, like it's quite a lot going on at that point, work out what happened. It was even more serious because his solicitor had an assistant, a woman, and they'd agreed to get married when he came out. And she changed her mind, and he was told on the day he was coming out that she didn't want to see him again, and had no preparation and nowhere to go. He then got interviewed on Radio 5, and I listened to it. I'd watched him on TV, listened to it, and they asked him about his experience being released after 18 years and so on. She said, what are you thinking? And he said, well, what I'm really thinking is I'd like to talk to you about your programming for boxing. And she said, you've been in prison for 18 years, you're being released and you want to talk to us about our programming. He said, yes, this is the only opportunity I'll have, and you don't program enough boxing. Those of us in prison like to hear it, and you don't program enough, and this is the only time they're going to have to take it. And I was thinking, as he said it, you know, here's the articulacy of somebody who's been in a dialogue group, knowing the moment, being receptive to it and using it. He did really well with it. I was quite impressed. In the end, one of the IRA prisoners who had been released had a similar experience and offered him accommodation that night. So he was really on his own, and the big thing for him was he couldn't stand being in such a big room to sleep. He'd been in a small room for so long that he felt like he was sleeping in a field, you know. But I did reconnect with him. I asked the prison governor, the warden, if I might bring him back into the prison to complete the dialogue group, which was a foolhardy request. But the warden had really been impressed with the quality of the dialogues, and he'd learnt a lot from them. And he was leaving the next week, so he gave written approval. So then I went to Jimmy and said, I have permission for you to come back in the prison if you'd like to come. Would you like to come? Yes. So we arranged, we met, took him back into the prison, and it was the most moving experience for people to complete something which otherwise is never completed. Prison's about wrenching stuff away from your life, your family, your work, and coming back and battling to get back involved at that level.
I can feel and hear in you how strongly that memory and that experience is with you.
Absolutely. And of course, he died a few years later from lung cancer from all his cigarettes, but powerful.
In terms of your experience and the story of dialogue and the impact of dialogue, that's a long way over a few years from going into Whitemoor for the first time, having never worked in a prison before, having your security briefing, bringing something new that nobody understood or knew what it was going to be, to establishing that level of credibility and impact, both on Jimmy Robinson, but also the governor in the prison, to then trust and say it would be okay to bring him back in. That's a big journey over a few years.
Yeah, but there was something about the dialogues and being genuine, saying actually what you're thinking and feeling as you understand it, that led to understanding all about the prison and how it worked. We knew far more about the workings of the prison than or aspects of it than did the staff. So gradually incorporating the staff and management into that was the big thing. Like, there's no reason why we shouldn't all understand how an organization works, but they're very compartmentalized. In prisons, of course, it's even more so, where some people have uniforms, some suits, and some not, and so on. Mm-hmm. But it was a great learning and a great adaptation, and it did really set a good beginning for much more that we could do from that. Mm.
And we will pick up on some of that in the next episode. But for now, we have a question. So in each episode, we invite a guest to join us and present a question. And today we've got a question from Leo Hylton, who is himself currently incarcerated in a prison in the US.
You share several examples of staff members and incarcerated people coming to better understandings of each other through engaging in dialogues. How did dialogue work to address power imbalances that existed within Her Majesty's prison at Whitemoor? Imbalances between power status of incarcerated people, because you mentioned heavy-duty prisoners, between staff and administrators and incarcerated people, and between volunteers and staff or administrators. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Thank you, Leo, for raising the question, and from a different perspective, from me coming into the prison and you being full-time in the prison. I hinted at the beginning about how the members of staff started to hear something they hadn't heard before with prisoners, and had experience also of management, senior management, coming into dialogues and being quite astounded by what they heard. So I think what happened was it was the beginning of staff not treating prisoners as a kind of commodity or a requirement or a number, but recognizing the people who were there. Now, I think anybody who's good in the business of corrections or prisons does that. So people do get to know prisoners and have a skill in doing that, but not openly in this way. It led to a different kind of discretion on how people manage the rules and enforce them within the prison. So the recognition that a rule is a rule, but a man who's just heard about the death of his wife or something, there's a chance to use a bit of discretion on how you enforce that rule. So people start to get interested in the changing experience of each other. And similarly, one occasion I remember one group of prisoners was really fed up with a security officer they had. So I said, well, invite him along, we'll talk with him. And they invited him to come, but he refused. I don't think he was that confident or liked what he was doing. But he was being very forceful on the way he ran things. And one of them said, why don't we love bomb him? Well, everything he says, bloody unreasonable. However unreasonable he is, let's just do it and not complain. And so they made a pact in the dialogue that what they would do is whatever he asked would be done kindly, and they did it. And then they report, they said he's very confused, he's not sure what's going on. And then in the end he said, he's really enjoying this. He started to talk with us, he's trying to find out. And so they started to take on some of the challenges, not with violence, but to start to lead to understanding. And the dialogues encourage that in depth. The first warden governor who came into a session came and told everybody how the prison would be run and what would and wouldn't happen. The last one who came when I was at Whitemoor came when there was a talk going on amongst prisoners where they didn't stop. They carried on. There were gypsy-like travellers who were talking about their experience, and he came in and sat and listened and realised this is where you think together and talk together and understand. So the relationships between people changed. The volunteer I mentioned who came at the very beginning, an elderly agricultural chemist called Chris, a Catholic who was very keen to help prisoners, he said to me, I belong to a golf club. He said, the conversation of the prisoner is much better than we get in the golf club. The quality of engagement was a thing that was happening. It didn't change the rules or the regime or how it operated, but it loosened it up hugely, and people found themselves growing. Also, people came to the dialogue group who would never go to a therapeutic session in anger management or sex offender treatment or something unless obliged. As they got thinking about themselves, they started to want to do that. It became a kind of where you work out what you're trying to do in your life and why you're where you are, kind of. So it affected everyone. It affected me as well quite deeply.
Very good, thank you. And thank you, Leo.
Thank you, Leo.
Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Ball, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Check out the show notes for extra information and links. Join us next time as we discuss Chapter 11 of A New Kind of Dialogue, where the practice of dialogue becomes much more established within the prison setting, and where I appear in the story.